My name is Andrew Walker. I'm an architect specializing in restoration projects. Old buildings, old structures, the kind of work where mistakes are expensive and egos are even more expensive. 3 years ago, my career almost ended. Documents were altered, calculations changed. Suddenly, a structure I had designed looked dangerously flawed. The investigation that followed nearly cost me my license. So when my career finally started recovering, I guarded my work like a paranoid dragon guarding a pile of steel beams. I had rebuilt my reputation, my license was safe, my firm was stable, and I was one of 3 finalists for the biggest restoration tender of my career, the Old Harbor District redevelopment. I had wanted that project for years, maybe longer than was healthy. The project that would erase the ugly stain from 3 years earlier. My wife, Megan, was beautiful in that highly disciplined way that made other people assume elegance and made me assume calculation. I already had reasons to be grateful to her. 3 years ago, during all that chaos with the stolen project and the investigation, she stood by my side. At least that was the version of events I had been living with. She came to meetings, sat in court, held my hand, told me I was not crazy when half the room treated me like a man having a professional breakdown in a blazer. The morning it started, I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for my car fob. That is how most disasters begin. Not with thunder, not with ominous music. Just a grown man in his kitchen muttering, "Where the hell did I put that thing?" Megan's bag was on the breakfast bar. I moved it to check under it and heard something heavy shift inside. Metal. Dense. I opened the bag and found a brass key. It was old, heavy. I turned it over in my hand. This was not from our house. I knew every lock we had. Front door, garage side door, basement storage, filing cabinets, site locker, office archive. "Megan," I called. She was at the dining table with coffee and her phone. She did not look up. "What?" I walked over, holding the key between 2 fingers. "What's this for?" She glanced at the key, then back at her phone as if I had asked about a coupon. "Why are you going through my bag?" "I was looking for my fob. Your handbag has spread over half the kitchen, so it became part of the search area." "That is not an answer. It's not a confession either. What is the key for?" She took a sip of coffee. Calm, bored, cold. Then she sighed. Not nervous, not defensive, annoyed. "Your paranoia again?" she said, finally raising her eyes to me. "I thought we were past this." I stared at her. "Past what? Asking a normal question?" "Interrogating me over random objects like I'm some suspect in your private little investigation." I gave the key a small lift. "This is not random. It's a very specific brass key from a very specific lock system, and I have never seen it before." She locked the phone, set it down, and leaned back. I said nothing, because I wanted to make sure I had heard her correctly. She mistook that for weakness. Big mistake. A common one, but still a mistake. "I'm serious," she went on. "I am not doing this with you again. I'm not going to justify every item I own because you're having a relapse of trust issues." That was cruel, efficient, and elegant. She reached straight for the scar tissue. 3 years earlier, I had gone through a situation at work that involved missing files, altered calculations, and a very ugly investigation. For a while, I genuinely thought someone was sabotaging me, and now she was using it like a household tool. "If you're going to start watching every step I take again," she said, voice flat and clean as glass, "get out." I leaned back in my chair and smiled. "Get out?" I repeated. "Yes. Over a key. Over your behavior." Interesting distinction. "Andrew, I'm not playing this game." I placed the key on the table between us. "So, what does it open?" I asked again. She crossed her arms. "None of your business." Now that was interesting. Married people with shared mortgages and shared groceries usually don't describe random keys as none of your business, unless there's a very good reason. I looked at her for another second. "Okay." I got up, picked up my actual car fob from the counter where it had been sitting in plain view like a smug little witness, and headed for the door. Behind me, Megan called, "Don't be dramatic." "I'm not dramatic," I said. I glanced back at her. "I'm curious." I left without another word. The drive to the office should have calmed me down. It did not. By the second red light, I had mentally disassembled the key 6 different ways. Brass alloy, older cut pattern, slight wear on the shoulder, not heavily used but not decorative, likely part of a building still using original or mid-century replacement lock systems. Definitely not modern residential. Definitely not recent commercial retrofit. At the third light, something clicked. Not emotionally, mechanically. That key belonged to a cylinder system manufactured by a German company that had stopped supplying this region around 2 decades earlier. I had only come across them in older institutional buildings that never fully modernized. I parked at the office and went straight upstairs without talking to anyone. In my office, I shut the door and opened the hardware archive database I had built years earlier for restoration reference. Most architects have hobbies. Mine was cataloging obsolete components, because apparently I enjoy making future interns think I died angry. 40 minutes later, I had narrowed it down, and then memory did the rest. The former Halbrecht Institute building, an old project institute downtown. More importantly, upper-level archive rooms in that building still had the old German cylinders. I sat back slowly. Megan had no legitimate reason to have access to that place. She had never worked there. She hated old buildings unless they had converted loft units and overpriced candles in the lobby. So why did she have a key? I could have called her again. I could have asked directly. Instead, I decided I'd figure it out without her help. I left the office early. I texted Megan that I had a meeting with a supplier and might be late. I parked 2 blocks from the Halbrecht building and waited. At 6:52, Megan's car turned onto Mercer. She did not park in front of the building. That would have been stupid. Instead, she left the car on a side street and walked the rest of the way. She did not use the main entrance. She went around the side, service access. I waited 10 seconds, got out, crossed the street, and followed. I kept my distance and reached the side entrance just in time to see the door ease shut. No keypad, mechanical cylinder. I touched the handle, locked again, which meant she had used the key. I walked the perimeter instead of forcing anything. The building still had the external fire stair access on the north side from its partial code retrofit years ago. Last time I was here, the 3rd floor landing window never latched properly in damp weather. Some people remember anniversaries. I remember defective closures. The window was still bad, not broken, just old enough to have standards lower than modern marriage. I got in. Inside, the building smelled like paper rot, metal, old paint, and cold stone. Familiar, honest smells. None of them lied to me. I climbed quietly. 4th floor, 5th. The top archive corridor was lit by the sort of institutional bulbs that make everyone look vaguely guilty. Rows of old fire doors, numbered rooms, reinforced storage, a freight elevator no sane person would trust. At the far end, one door stood slightly ajar. Warm light leaked through the gap. I moved closer and heard voices. A man first. Low, confident, amused. My body recognized him before my mind admitted it. Ryan Caldwell. Of course. People enter your life and leave a scar. 3 years ago, the project that nearly destroyed me had passed through channels close enough to him to make suspicion inevitable and proof impossible. I had always believed he was behind it. I had never been able to pin it down. Until that moment, standing in a dusty corridor while my wife met him in a private archive, like they were starring in a very pretentious betrayal opera. Then I heard Megan laugh softly. I moved closer to the door and looked through the narrow opening. Ryan had one arm around her waist. Megan was leaning into him. This was not one bad choice. This was routine with good tailoring. He kissed the side of her face. She touched his tie and said, "You are impossible." "No," he said. I'm just consistently right. I almost laughed. Ryan opened a folder on the table. How current? He asked. Current enough, Megan said. He updated the harbor support calculations 2 nights ago. Every muscle in my back went still. Ryan opened the folder. And he still hasn't noticed? Megan gave a tiny shrug. Andrew notices details when he expects danger. He doesn't look for it at home anymore. Then Ryan smiled. That trusting now? He wants to be, she said. After everything that happened, he needs to believe I was on his side. My hand tightened against the wall. Inside the room, Ryan flipped through the folder. He's really proud of this port. He thinks it saves him, Megan said. That's the best part. Then Ryan laughed under his breath and said the words that took the floor out from under the last weak corner of doubt. He still has no idea you gave me access the first time. Megan folded her arms and leaned one hip against the archive table. The first time was harder. Back then he still checked everything. Now he practically hands me the map. Ryan looked up. So the court act really worked. She smirked. He was desperate. I sat beside him, looked wounded on command, and suddenly I was the one person he thought never betrayed him. Ryan tapped the folder. With this, I can beat him at the harbor tender. You won't just beat him, Megan said. You'll humiliate him. He gave her a pleased look. You always know what I like. She smiled at him with a warmth I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. That did hurt. Not in a tragic, broken man way. More like discovering your houseplant had been mocking you for years. I watched them a little longer, long enough to memorize the room, the folder, the positioning, the confidence. Then I stepped back soundlessly and left the way I came. By the time I got to the street, my pulse had steadied. That was the strangest part. You would think a man who had just discovered his wife was sleeping with his old enemy and feeding him project data would be screaming into the night or punching masonry like an underwritten action character. Instead, I was thinking about access layers, version history, and expert review thresholds. Because if Ryan was stealing current structural calculations from my harbor proposal, then Ryan had a weakness. He trusted theft more than talent. And people like that always mistake access for understanding. So I decided to play on that. I started the engine and drove back to the office. I unlocked my office, walked in, and placed both hands on the desk. Okay, I said to the room. Now we stop being polite. I turned on the desk lamp, opened the Harbor District project folder, and stared at the structural model on the screen. Months of work. Load calculations. Foundation stress projections. Tidal pressure simulations. Ryan thought he was stealing a finished design. What he was actually stealing was trust. Trust in numbers. Trust in my work. That trust was about to become his biggest problem. Because engineers know something most people don't. The most dangerous mistake in a structure is not a big one. Big mistakes are obvious. They scream. Small mistakes whisper. And whispers are what collapse bridges 10 years later. Ryan wasn't a structural engineer. He was a designer with good marketing instincts and just enough technical knowledge to sound confident in meetings. That meant he would check the big numbers. He would look at the final diagrams. He would trust the calculations, but he wouldn't rebuild the entire load model from scratch. Almost nobody does, except expert reviewers. And expert reviewers were exactly who would be sitting in that tender room. I opened the secondary support sheet, scrolled, found the tidal load distribution table, and changed one number. Not dramatically, just slightly. The kind of adjustment that looked like an elegant optimization. Something that saved material. Something that made the design look clever. But the moment a real structural engineer recalculated the loads, the math would collapse. Not the harbor. The proposal. I leaned back and looked at the screen. Perfect, I muttered. The trick wasn't making the error obvious. The trick was making it believable. Believable enough that a thief would proudly present it. I updated the model, saved the file, uploaded the new version to the cloud. Then I checked the access permissions. Megan still had access to the folder. Of course she did. I left it that way. A trap is useless if the door is locked. The next morning, Megan was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. Coffee, phone, silence. The same morning routine we had followed for years. If someone had walked in, they would have seen a perfectly ordinary married couple. No shouting, no accusations, just quiet domestic life. "Big week?" she asked without looking up. "Always." "The harbor presentation is soon, right?" "Friday." She nodded slightly. "You've worked too hard on that project to lose it." I poured coffee. "Don't worry," I said. "I won't." She glanced up then, just for a second, trying to read something in my face. People do that when they think they're the smartest person in the room. They assume everyone else is predictable. Megan had spent years thinking she knew exactly how I reacted to pressure. Stressed, quiet, obsessive, not dangerous. She was about to update that assumption. Later that afternoon, I checked the server logs. Cloud systems record everything, every login, every file opened, every download. At 2:43 p.m., a familiar device appeared. Megan's laptop. The Harbor District folder opened. Structural model accessed. Support calculations downloaded. I watched the timestamps like a man watching fish swim directly into a net. "Right on schedule," I said quietly. Ryan wouldn't ask questions. Why would he? From his perspective, Megan had been feeding him reliable data for years. Why doubt the source now? I closed the logs and leaned back in the chair. There is a very special kind of calm that comes when revenge stops being emotional and becomes logistical. You stop imagining arguments. You start imagining timing. Ryan would copy the calculations. Ryan would incorporate them into his proposal. Ryan would walk into the final tender presentation feeling brilliant. And when the expert panel started asking questions, the math would betray him. Not dramatically, professionally. Which, in my world, is far worse. I shut down the computer and stood up. Somewhere out there, Ryan was probably celebrating already. Somewhere, Megan was probably convinced she had played me perfectly. That thought almost made me smile. Because the funny thing about architects is that we spend our entire careers designing things that don't collapse. Ryan was about to demonstrate exactly what happens when someone builds on stolen foundations. And the best part? Neither of them had any idea the structure had already started failing. The week moved quickly after that. Strange how time behaves when you stop hoping and start waiting. Monday and Tuesday passed in a blur of routine work. Meetings, emails, a site inspection that required me to pretend I cared about brick color samples, while my brain quietly replayed the conversation I had heard in that archive room. By Wednesday, the Harbor District presentation materials were finalized. Models rendered, slides polished, technical appendices printed. My team assumed the tension came from the scale of the project. They weren't wrong, just not entirely right. Thursday evening, the City Council confirmed the final presentation schedule. 3 firms, 3 presentations, 1 decision. Ryan Caldwell's firm would present second, which meant I would have a front row seat. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray coastal weather that makes every building look slightly more dramatic than it deserves. The council chamber overlooked the harbor itself. Old stone walls, large windows, a room designed to make public decisions feel historic, even when they were mostly about budgets. By the time I arrived, the other firms were already there. Ryan stood near the windows, speaking with 2 members of the review committee. He looked exactly the way I remembered. Perfect suit, relaxed posture, the kind of smile that suggested confidence without effort. When he noticed me, he walked over like we were old colleagues meeting at a conference instead of 2 men quietly trying to destroy each other's careers. "Andrew," he said warmly, "good to see you." "Ryan." He glanced toward the harbor through the windows. "Beautiful project." "It will be." His smile widened slightly. "You've always had a talent for these restoration concepts." "I appreciate that." There was a brief pause. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You know, after everything that happened a few years ago, it's impressive you bounced back. I held his gaze. Yes, I said calmly. It is. For a moment I wondered if he knew. Not suspected. Knew. But the confidence in his expression told me everything I needed to know. Ryan believed he was about to win. The first firm presented. Solid proposal, safe design. No real chance of beating either of us. Then it was Ryan's turn. He stepped to the front of the chamber, greeted the council members, and began presenting the Harbor District redevelopment plan. And it was beautiful. Of course it was. The renderings were excellent. The structural concepts looked clean. The support system diagrams were familiar, because they were mine. He walked through the presentation with smooth confidence, explaining the support structure for the main pier, the tidal load distribution, the reinforcement strategy for the secondary supports. He explained it well, almost convincingly. Almost. I watched the faces of the technical panel sitting near the front. 2 structural engineers, 1 port infrastructure consultant, 1 maritime construction specialist. They listened politely, but when Ryan reached the support load calculations, something changed. One of the engineers leaned forward slightly. Another began flipping through the printed appendix. Ryan didn't notice. Why would he? From his perspective, everything was perfect. Then the first question came. Mr. Caldwell, one of the engineers said, adjusting his glasses. Could you clarify the safety margin used in the secondary pier supports? Ryan nodded easily. Of course. We optimized the margin slightly to reduce material costs while maintaining structural integrity. Optimized, the engineer repeated. Yes. The engineer glanced at the document again. Then he looked up. Because according to these numbers, your optimization reduces the tolerance below acceptable standards under certain tidal stress conditions. The room grew very quiet. Ryan blinked. Excuse me? The engineer turned the page and tapped the calculation table. This load distribution would create a progressive stress imbalance across the secondary support grid. Ryan's confidence wavered for the first time. That shouldn't be the case. Another engineer spoke. Have you recalculated the full load model after adjusting this parameter? Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But in a room full of engineers, hesitation is louder than shouting. He turned back to the screen and began scrolling through the structural model. The numbers stared back at him. Perfectly organized. Perfectly wrong. The first engineer leaned back in his chair. I'm afraid this configuration would fail expert review immediately. Someone near the back of the room shifted in their seat. Ryan cleared his throat. There may have been a formatting issue in the documentation. Formatting does not change structural load distribution, the engineer replied calmly. Now the tension in the room was obvious. Ryan tried to recover. We can, of course, review the calculations again before final approval. Mr. Caldwell, the council chair interrupted gently. These proposals were submitted as final designs. Ryan nodded stiffly. Yes, of course. He finished the presentation quickly after that. Too quickly. The confidence was gone now. When he returned to his seat, he didn't look at me, which was wise, because I was smiling. Then my firm was called. I walked to the front of the chamber and connected my laptop to the projector. Good morning, I said. The council chair nodded. Mr. Walker, please begin. I started the presentation slowly. Not rushed, not defensive, just calm. The design appeared on the screen. Harbor restoration, pier reinforcement, load balancing across the support grid. When I reached the structural calculations, I paused. Then I glanced toward the technical panel. You may notice something interesting, I said. One of the engineers looked up. Interesting how? I clicked to the calculation table. These are the correct load margins for the secondary pier supports. The engineer studied the numbers, then nodded slowly. Yes, that configuration maintains structural balance. I leaned slightly against the podium. The reason I mention this is because a nearly identical design was presented a few minutes ago. The room became very quiet again. Ryan's head turned sharply toward me. I continued calmly. The difference is that the other version contained a very specific calculation error. The engineer spoke again. The error we just discussed. Yes. I met Ryan's eyes across the room. An error that would only appear if someone copied the structural model without fully understanding the load distribution. Ryan's expression changed. The confidence, the composure, gone, replaced by something colder. Realization. The council chair looked between us. Mr. Walker, are you suggesting something? I nodded slightly. I'm suggesting that structural engineering is not something you can steal. Silence filled the chamber. Then the port consultant leaned back and said quietly, "Well, that explains quite a lot." Ryan didn't react immediately. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the screen where my calculations were still projected for everyone in the room to see. It was the kind of silence that stretches just a little too long. The council members looked between us. The engineers were already flipping through both proposals. And Ryan was doing the one thing a man like him hates most, thinking in public. Finally, he stood, slowly. "Are you accusing my firm of plagiarism, Andrew?" he asked. His voice was calm, too calm, the type of calm that appears when someone is trying very hard not to lose control in front of important people. I shrugged slightly. "I'm an architect, Ryan. I prefer to let the structure speak for itself." One of the engineers raised a hand. "If I may," he said. The council chair nodded. The engineer held up Ryan's printed appendix. "These calculations match Mr. Walker's structural framework almost exactly, except for the incorrect margin adjustment we just discussed." Ryan opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "There must have been a misunderstanding during the modeling phase." "Possibly," the engineer replied. "But the probability of two independent teams producing identical calculations, including identical formatting, while only one contains a critical structural error," he paused, "is extremely low." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Ryan's jaw tightened. The council chair leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Caldwell, do you wish to clarify your calculations before the panel continues?" Ryan hesitated. And that hesitation was fatal, because the moment a professional panel senses uncertainty, the credibility is already gone. "I believe," Ryan said carefully, "that our engineering team may need to review that section again." The maritime consultant gave a small, dry laugh. "You mean after the tender?" Ryan didn't answer. The chair nodded once. "Very well. Thank you, Mr. Walker. You may continue." I finished the presentation without rushing. Structural plan, budget estimates, timeline, environmental preservation strategy, all the things I had actually designed. When I finished, the panel asked a few questions. Professional ones. Detailed ones. The kind of questions people ask when they're evaluating a real proposal instead of cleaning up someone else's mess. 20 minutes later, the presentations were over. The council asked all three firms to step outside while they discussed the decision. Ryan followed me into the corridor. The moment the doors closed behind us, he grabbed my arm. Hard. "You did that," he said quietly. I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. "Did what?" "That calculation." "Ryan," I said calmly, "you presented it." His eyes narrowed. "You planted it. That would imply you copied something." He held my gaze for a few seconds. Then he released my arm. "You think this is over?" I smiled slightly. "Oh, Ryan." I leaned a little closer so only he could hear me. "This ended 3 years ago." His expression shifted. Not anger. Recognition. He knew exactly what I meant. Across the hallway, the council doors opened again. A staff member stepped out. "The panel has reached a decision." We went back inside. The chair folded her hands on the table. After reviewing the proposals and technical evaluations, the Harbor District restoration contract will be awarded to... She glanced down briefly. Walker Restoration Group. The words hung in the room for a moment. My team behind me quietly exhaled. One of the engineers nodded in approval. Ryan didn't move. The chair continued. Additionally, due to the serious structural inconsistencies found in the Caldwell proposal, the council will be requesting a formal review of that submission. That landed exactly the way it should. Ryan's career wasn't just losing a contract. It was about to face an investigation. The meeting ended shortly after. People shook hands. Documents were collected. Congratulations were exchanged. Ryan left the room without saying another word. I watched him go. Then I stepped outside into the cold harbor air. The wind coming off the water smelled like salt and steel. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest was gone. But the day wasn't finished yet. Because Ryan had only been half of the problem. Megan was the other half. And she was still waiting at home, probably expecting a very different outcome. I drove back slowly, not because I needed time to think. The plan was already finished. When I walked into the house, Megan was sitting in the living room, wine glass in hand, phone on the table. She looked up. "Well?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, placed something on the table, and then came back. "What's that?" she asked. I stepped aside so she could see it clearly. A stack of printed access logs from my project server. Her face changed. "Megan," I said calmly, "we need to talk." She set the wine glass down. "You're overreacting again." I almost laughed. "Am I?" She crossed her arms. "You clearly misunderstood something." I nodded slowly. "Actually, I understood everything." I leaned against the table. "Remember what you told me the morning I found the key?" She didn't answer. I smiled slightly. "You said, 'Get out.'" Silence. I slid a set of documents across the table. "I took your advice," I said. Her eyes dropped to the papers. "You're leaving?" I shook my head. "No, you're leaving. The archive building key will still be useful," I said calmly. "For visiting Ryan." Her mouth opened. Closed. For once in her life, Megan had nothing to say. I picked up my coat, paused at the door, then looked back at her one last time. "You have 1 hour to pack your things and leave so you're not in my house when I get back," I said. She blinked. "What?" I opened the door, and then I left. 2 weeks later, the Harbor District project stopped being the biggest opportunity of my life and became something much less dramatic. Work, meetings, permits, an endless stream of documents that smelled more like bureaucracy than the ocean. For years I had imagined that winning this project would feel like a victory scene from a movie, the kind where you stand somewhere high above the city, wind in your coat, thinking about everything you survived to get there. It didn't feel like that. Victory turned out to be quieter. It looked like a signed contract on my desk and a team of engineers arguing about pile depths and steel grades. And honestly, that suited me just fine. The news about Ryan Caldwell started spreading about a week after the tender. The City Council initiated a technical review of his proposal after the inconsistencies in his structural calculations were flagged by the panel. That alone was enough to start conversations in the industry. Architecture circles are small, smaller than people think. By the end of the month, 2 of Ryan's major clients had quietly withdrawn from ongoing negotiations with his firm. No official statements, no public accusations, just polite emails about reconsidering project direction, which, in professional language, usually means we don't want to be associated with whatever just happened. Reputations in our field don't always collapse dramatically. Sometimes they fail the same way badly designed structures do, quietly, under their own weight. As for Megan, she did leave. When I returned home that night after giving her an hour to pack, the house was already half empty. Her clothes were gone from the closet. A few boxes had disappeared from the living room. The brass key, however, was still sitting on the kitchen table. I left it there for a while, as a reminder, just as something that hadn't yet decided where it belonged. The divorce process started 3 weeks later. Predictably, Megan tried a few familiar tactics: confusion, denial. You misunderstood the situation. That wasn't what it looked like. You're overreacting. But none of those arguments work very well when the other person has already heard the truth with their own ears. Eventually, the negotiations became practical. Assets, accounts, paperwork. Marriage, it turns out, dissolves through documentation just as efficiently as business partnerships do. 6 months later, the Harbor District reconstruction began. The first morning construction started. I stood on the pier with the engineering team, watching the first support piles being driven into the seabed, steel disappearing into the water. One after another. Foundations, the kind that actually hold. Then I took the brass key out of my coat pocket. I had kept it. Not out of nostalgia, out of symmetry. For a moment I turned it in my hand. Then I walked to the edge of the pier and dropped it into the water. It disappeared instantly, like it had never belonged anywhere at all. I watched the harbor waves roll over the place where it had sunk. Some doors, I said, are better left closed. If you felt this story hit hard, drop a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps Steelheart beating.